Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Kaminsky, Director of Outreach and Communications for the Climate Registry. I want to start by recognizing our 2021 Climate Leadership Award winners. Yesterday's showcase was inspiring, and we congratulate you all again on your dedication to ambitious climate action. You can read more about our winners and their achievements by visiting the awards page on our website at climateleadershipconference.org. And one more call out to our 2021 sponsors, without whom none of this would be made possible. We're expanding our reach and will continue programming throughout the remainder of the year with their generous support. If you haven't already, we invite you to our exhibit hall on the left side of your hop-in screen. Special thanks to our headline sponsor, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and host city sponsor, Entergy. I'd like to remind you all that you can engage with one another through the chat function or locate a specific colleague through the People tab, both located on the right side of your hop-in screen. And today's sessions are being recorded. You can access the final recordings in the replay section located on the left side of your hop-in screen. We have an exciting day of programming for you as well, focusing on the global race to net zero. You'll hear from Governor Jay Inslee and an impressive lineup of speakers who will share what they see as our greatest opportunities to lead over the next important decade towards decarbonization. And with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague and event co-host, Verena Radulovic, Vice President for Business Engagement at C2ES.
Thank you, Jen. It is great to be here today. And I'm excited to introduce our next panel. Our next panel will be on the America is All In, presenting breakthrough technologies and policies with an all-in approach for achieving U.S. climate goals. America is All In created a new report called Blueprint 2030, and we're going to be joined by its authors today to describe why an all-in climate strategy from the federal, state, and non-governmental actors is needed to cut emissions by at least 50% by 2030. And not only that, but we need to cut emissions and prepare us for a fully decarbonized economy by mid-century. We're lucky to have with us a distinguished panel today to share the main points of the report and then to engage in a discussion afterwards. First, we're going to be joined by Kevin Kennedy, who's Senior Fellow at the U.S. Climate Initiative at the World Resources Institute, and he's going to walk us through the main findings and recommendations, and he'll then be joined by the other panelists for a discussion. Other panelists will be Leon Clark, the Acting Director for the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, Lainey Rowland, who is an associate for the U.S. program at RMI, Alicia Zhao, Research Associate at the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, and her counterpart at WRI, Tom Sears, another research associate who helped put the report together. So Kevin, I'd like to turn to you. I know you're going to walk us through the report, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards.
So I'm getting feedback.
Uh-oh.
Okay. We seem to be fine now. Not quite sure what happened there. So thank you very much, Verena. And thanks for inviting us to talk about the new report, Blueprint 2030, from America is All In. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks fairly brief so we can get into more detail in the discussion. The report was developed by the core analytic team for All In with contributions from WRI, University of Maryland, and RMI. And on the next slide, we can see that the core partners for America is All In also include WWF, Climate Nexus, and Ceres. And we appreciate the support that we received from Bloomberg Philanthropies. The broader coalition includes a variety of partners representing cities, states, tribes, universities, healthcare systems, and others. That said, the report and its findings are the product of the analytic team. This is our assessment of how non-governmental or non-federal action can work with the federal government to provide a durable path to 52% emission reductions that have been promised in the US NDC and help put the country on the path towards net zero by mid-century. It's something of a call to action for those who want to be all in on climate. not a platform endorsed by all those in the coalition. On the next slide, we see that the non-federal climate movement in the United States is massive. In recent years, we've seen thousands of non-federal leaders from across the country who have carried the torch on climate change and remain committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement. Together, these institutions represent 2/3 of the US population, 70% of its economy, and half of the US emissions. On the next slide, we start getting into what this all-in climate strategy that we looked at is all about. We see this as key to the country's ability to meet its 2030 emissions target and to accelerate action through mid-century. But how does it work? An important aspect of the strategy is that it offers important synergies that feed on each other and deliver more than you could get from any individual actor or actions. To take an example of electric vehicles, states can set ambitious zero-emission vehicle policies that help create a bigger market for EVs. Automakers are already recognizing the need to shift in the coming decade to stay in tune both with ambitious policies and with customer demand, and so are committing significant investments towards electric vehicles. Those trends can make it easier for the federal government then to establish strong national requirements, creating even more momentum in the market. In the meantime, federal infrastructure investments can very much help push charging infrastructure, and that will help eliminate one of the key concerns that consumers have. And state and local governments can help direct that funding to where it's going to be most effective and create policies and incentives to make it easier to install chargers. I could go on, but you get the idea. These actions all reinforce each other in ways that speed the transition and make it easier for achieving the goals. Similar dynamics can play out in other sectors of the economy, of course. So on the next slide, we start to see some of the policy framework that we presented in Blueprint 2030. This policy framework provides a detailed roadmap for achieving our climate goals, a 50% reduction or more by 2030. On this slide, we show the highlights from that policy framework. I won't try to go into this in any detail in the interest of time, but just flag that it includes mandates and incentives aimed at phasing out the sale of new internal combustion vehicles, moving to 100% clean electricity, significant electrification in buildings and industry, increased implementation of nature-based solutions in the land sector, and more. It's an ambitious framework that reflects the need for rapid progress across the economy to meet our targets. So on the next slide, we see what it can deliver in terms of emission reductions. Our core modeling results show a 52% economy-wide reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. This is led by major reductions in emissions in the power sector and in transport. But it's important to recognize that action is going to be needed from all sectors of the economy, including buildings, industry, and the land sector. And beyond the greenhouse gas emission reductions, these actions can also help deliver better health through improved air quality, lower energy costs for consumers, good jobs, and a revitalized manufacturing sector, improved ecosystems, and increased resilience. So on the next slide, just to highlight that this report really provides a roadmap for necessary, urgent, and ambitious action. We show what's possible when all levels of society contribute to meeting shared goals to invest in a safe future. It leads not only to the necessary level of emission reductions, but also to a slew of benefits that improve our communities, fuel a more prosperous and inclusive economy, and steward healthy lands for the next generation. As these shifts take hold, this type of transformative change is going to be difficult to undo. But it does first require seizing the moment today and making significant investments in enabling ambitious supportive policies. So thank you for this chance to share our findings, and let me turn it back to Verena for some discussion about the report.
Yeah, well, let's bring everybody up and get into it. All right, so when we look at the report, you're looking at a mix of actions from the federal government, from states, and from non-state actors from the private sector. So I'll turn to Alicia, since I know you're one of the report authors behind the methodology. Can you tell us a little bit about the methods that you're using to measure the impacts that this combination of policies and actions would have?
Sure. Thanks, Serena. I'd be happy to do that. So we measured the emissions impacts of this mix of federal and non-federal actions using a combination of a bottom-up and a top-down approach. So first, using the bottom-up approach, we collected activity data corresponding to particular types of climate action at the city, state, and business levels. For example, we looked at renewable generation resulting from state and city policies and targets. We then aggregated the effects of all of these different actions as well as their interactions with each other, just so that we didn't have any overlap or double counting. Then with our top-down economy-wide analysis, we used a model called GCAM USA, which is an integrated assessment model with a detailed representation of the US energy system. So the aggregated results from the bottom-up analysis feed into GCAM USA as input. And then using GCAM USA, we can estimate the greenhouse gas emissions as a result of these different non-federal and federal actions. So these two components kind of interact and feed back into each other. So the final scenario results are the outcome of this combined process. I do want to note that not every policy went through this combined approach. Some policies were, in fact, just directly modeled through the economy-wide analysis if we decided that for that particular policy, we didn't need more granular data.
You've also included in the report an extensive policy platform detailing what is needed to hit the 2030 NDC or to beat the NDC. So Tom, maybe I'll bring Tom up. Can you share with us, how did you develop that platform? What is it based on, and how does it relate to the modeling that Alicia just talked about?
Yeah, sure. Happy to speak to that. Thanks, Verena. So yeah, like you mentioned, our report does indeed feature a fairly extensive policy platform for how the U.S. can hit 50% below 2005 emissions levels or better by 2030. And this was developed, I would say, through two primary processes that the team conducted in parallel and which were very much interlinked. So the first was a qualitative process that involved external review and literature review to make sure we sort of had the comprehensive list of ambitious measures. And then the second element was a quantitative process that involved economy-wide emissions modeling to estimate the core elements of the policy platform and confirm the expected emissions results. So the sort of net result of that whole process is this detailed readout of how federal, state, corporate, institutional, and other actors can all contribute to driving the emissions results shown in the modeling. And the report very much views, each of these actors as playing a unique role.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then in response to the second part of your question about the modeling, many of the elements of the platform are modeled pretty explicitly using our bottom-up and top-down infrastructure. But also, as Alicia mentioned, naturally, not every policy in the platform is explicitly quantified. But regardless, because of the way we approached this, all the measures in the platform are seen as critical drivers of the overall economy-wide and sector-specific emissions results. So, as an example of that, for renewable energy transmission build-out in state and local jurisdictions, siting policy is obviously going to be very important for that. And while that's not something that's directly going into the power sector modeling, that's of course seen as something that will be really important for driving the overall results, and so is included in the platform. So yeah, to sum up, the modeling is the sort of quantitative result we're aiming for, and the policy platform is the detailed roadmap, and they're sort of two sides of the same coin. And by presenting them together, we sort of paint the fuller picture of this roadmap to 2030.
I do have one small follow-up question to that. Are the policies, in addition to the actions that are laid out in the report, do all policies need to be implemented to be able to get to 2030? Or is it sort of like, can you dial one up or dial one down, and then will the report kind of show the reader what happens if certain policies are not enacted versus if certain ones are?
Yeah, so this report shows sort of the aggregate effect of these policies together, since we sort of have these sector-specific and economy-wide results. That's really an aggregation exercise and really looking at the aggregate effect. In terms of how this all plays out on the ground, in theory, you could certainly dial certain things up or dial certain things down. And there are synergies at play that are, difficult to quantify and difficult to model, but which are certainly going to be critical to implementation. And Kevin described some of that during his presentation as well, about, the synergies between state, local, business, and federal efforts in driving vehicle electrification. So I would say, the results provide the aggregate effect, sort of the best representation of all of this dynamism that's at play. And while this is not something that's explicitly quantified, the more robust climate action actually ends up being, the more non-federal and federal actors adopt measures in this platform, we feel the better chance we have of hitting the US NDC or beating it in 2030.
I just asked that question because our conference is occurring at a time in our country where we are looking at a number of policies that are being debated in Congress right now. So I think that there's a relevance to the report that you guys just put out with the real-time conversations that are happening around climate provisions. So thank you, Tom. I'm going to turn now to Leon. Leon, there's been a lot of concern over the years that we don't have the technology or the solutions that we need to achieve this transformation, but the Blueprint 2030 report contends that we do. Can you talk about which technologies are most primed for rapid deployment?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And I think when you're thinking about technology, it's important to split it into two parts. So one of those is the long term, and one of those is the near term. So the long term is the near term is how do we get to 2030? How do we think about meeting the goals in the NDC? The longer term is how do we get down towards zero around mid-century? And those have really very different technological implications. So if we're thinking about the long term, then yeah, some advances in technology would be very valuable to make it easier to get down to net zero. So for example, if we think about hydrogen from electrolysis, we can think about biomass, we can think about synthetic fuels, ammonia, other energy carriers that we can use instead of electricity in places where it's hard to use electricity, for example, industrial heat or airplanes. That's going to be really important in the long run. So is carbon dioxide removal in all likelihood. It'll be important for us to find a way to store carbon from the atmosphere in a way that will allow us to still have some residual emissions. But that's the long run. This report is looking at what we need to do over the next, a little over 8 years now at this point. And in that context, we do have a lot of technological options. They're already in place, and we have a lot that we can move on quite quickly. So I think we're all pretty aware at a meeting like this about how fast solar cells have moved forward, PVs, that is, how fast wind has moved, where electricity storage has gone in batteries. And those particular changes, as well as others, have really changed what our perceptions are for what we can achieve in the near term, particularly in electricity and in transportation. And it's really no coincidence that when you look at our study, as well as others that have looked at trying to get to 50 by 2030, you see much of the emissions reductions coming from the electricity sector, maybe like 50%, and then from transportation, maybe another 25%, roughly speaking, but like 3/4 coming from those two. And then, of course, you need to make action everywhere else and eke it out. But we do have a lot of opportunities in the near term. But one thing to remember is that doesn't mean that we don't need a lot of support for this. This is a really rapid transition. It is only a little over 8 years to get down to 2030. And so the question really is, how do we support the deployment of this technological change at a relatively rapid pace? And what do we think about the institutional needs? What do we think about supporting infrastructure? All of those dimensions are going to be critical. And that's one of the reasons why we believe that this all-in approach is going to be extremely critical. You're going to need to have all elements of society. You're going to need the federal government, states, cities, businesses, all involved to really be rowing in the same direction if we're going to make this happen. So it's possible. Yeah. So it's possible. Yes, we do have the technology and we can make it happen for sure. But we really do need an all of society approach to manage this transition.
Great. Thank you so much. Leon, I have like 7 questions for you, but I realize we only have 10 minutes left. So we'll get back to that and about the different technologies. So we'll see if we can get back there if we can. But I actually, I want to turn to Lainey now. Much of our audience represents the private sector. And I think building off of what Leon was saying about the all-in approach, and we need to have sort of all hands on deck, the private sector plays an important role. Can you highlight some of the major actions that we need to see coming from the private sector and what those actions can mean in terms of impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think I'll start by quickly turning back to the big picture that Kevin teed up and Leon just touched on. That kind of explains why we see outsized impact from non-federal actors in general, including private sector leaders. Namely, when we look at non-federal action today, which we do in the report, we see that it can and does have tremendous ripple effects. It has already changed the landscape in very tangible ways. And when we look at the change needed in the next decade, or more kind of accurately next 8 years, we see that building on this leadership can push us farther and faster towards our climate goals. And of course, the private sector plays a really important role. And in the report in Blueprint 2030, we show how this type of feedback can help meet the challenges in each emitting sector. So I'll go ahead and highlight a few of those actions and examples from the private sector. Of course, the report itself provides relatively more comprehensive coverage than I can do in the time we have left. First, unsurprisingly, in the private sector, we see a major role for continued innovation and investment. To take one example, in the transportation space, there's a huge opportunity when it comes to electrifying heavy-duty fleets, but we're not quite there yet, as we know, at scale. So businesses that manage large fleets, goes without saying, can help us get there faster by testing and investing in this type of technology. We also see opportunities to expand markets for low-carbon products and, of course, clean energy. In industry, for example, businesses in manufacturing fields can help set and implement standards for low carbon materials like steel or cement. Similarly, in the power sector, businesses can keep building on significant leadership and existing commitments to target round-the-clock clean energy and keep pushing the envelope on procurement. And I could go on. In the interest of time, I'll stop there. But I do want to note, and Kevin alluded to this earlier, you'll see we also have the word durable in the report title. And we see these market-driven changes in particular as hard to undo. And that overall is a really important characteristic of an all-in strategy. One of the most important benefits and part of what makes the private sector in particular so impactful.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Lainey. And I kind of want to tease out a couple of themes that I just heard from Leon and Lainey before I turn to Kevin to kind of talk about COP26 that's coming up. But when we look at the role of the private sector and we look at the different policies that are out there, can you, either of you, maybe Leon or Lainey, talk about the market-based mechanisms that don't need to wait for government action? Are there any policies that the private sector can take where they can implement today, or are there certain areas where there's a need for government support or policy to help kind of level playing fields? I'm thinking about specifically yesterday, we had a conversation with power sector CEOs where SoCalGas mentioned hydrogen, sort of the use of the existing natural gas infrastructure for hydrogen. And that's one of the nascent technologies that in theory, could be developed. But so I think that's where my brain is. If you can talk about what are some of the market-based mechanisms or other policies that don't necessarily need government support, but that are ready to go now.
That's a tough question. I'm going to see if Kevin or Lainey or Tom want to jump in on that.
I was just curious.
I'll see if Kevin or Tom or Lainey want to jump in on that.
I mean, I would just say that I think the hydrogen example is a really good example of something that's more nascent and will likely be critical in the medium to longer term, and so certainly could could stand to benefit from federal investments and RD&D in the coming years. So I think there's a need potentially for some federal levers there. But I think there's, in terms of policies that can, send really strong market signals now, I think there's a lot that are sort of like, sort of can be readily implemented now, are being implemented now, can be scaled up now, sort of regardless of regulatory levers or federal investment. So, for example, large renewable energy buyers setting ambitious targets and negotiating with their utilities to procure renewable electricity on a 24/7, 365 days a year basis is a big one. We've already seen some companies step up and do that. And I think that can sort of sometimes help solve also the chicken and egg problem of demand versus supply, and just send a really strong signal and create the demand that's needed in order to build out more capacity. So.
Thank you, Tom. And I just want to point to one of Lainey's remarks about the use of sort of procurement to reduce emissions in the supply chain is another big lever that could be its own panel all by itself. But that's something I think really key where the private sector can move quickly. So I'm going to end with Kevin. We are just a few weeks away from COP26 at a time when the domestic climate policy is also in place. We've got reconciliation in the House and Senate. We've also got, in about 2 weeks, the U.S. is sending a lot of its cabinet over to Glasgow, Scotland, to negotiate ambitious climate action for the next decade. Can you speak to this moment for how the U.S. signals its comprehensive achievable emissions reduction plan to achieve its NDC at COP? And I guess if you could pick any of the most salient takeaways that are relevant from this report, you can share that with us.
Sure. Obviously, at Glasgow, one of the big questions folks are going to have for the United States is, can we really deliver on the commitments that the Biden administration has made? And as you note, there's major focus today, these weeks, on what's going on in Congress and the debates over reconciliation and the infrastructure package. And there's good reason for that. The more that we succeed in getting over the finish line in Congress this year in terms of climate and clean energy action, the easier it's going to be able to meet the NDC targets going forward. But one of the key messages from our report is that Congress is important, the federal government is important, but they're not the only game in town. Climate leadership in the US for the last 4 years, and to some degree much longer than that, has come from non-federal actors stepping up to the plate and helping build momentum. That activity builds on a long foundation of states and cities and businesses taking leadership. And examples range from vehicle emission standards, initially spearheaded by California, adopted by other states, renewable energy policies and purchase commitments from both the public and private sector, a lot of other areas. These types of non-federal action can really provide strong and durable foundation for progress on climate and clean energy in the US, and really can help create political support for stronger federal policies. And we saw an example of that in recent years with hydrofluorocarbons, where states were taking action, and that helped build momentum and helped build, greater corporate support for Congress to take action on HFCs, which they did last year.
Yep.
So those types of synergies can really build the degree of momentum over time. And the way that the federal government and non-federal actors work together can really build economic momentum for a clean energy transition that will be difficult to undo over time.
Yeah.
As we see, renewable power is increasingly the low-cost option. We see, as charging infrastructure gets put in place, it's not going to come back out, and that's going to provide opportunities for people interested in EVs to adopt them. Wider adoption of efficient heat pumps and other types of appliances will really be able to help push sort of the cost curves down on those. And, as those get built into the economy, that's going to be a durable change. And so our report really reinforces the important role of non-federal actors, what they have done and what they can do in the future, alongside the federal government in delivering on climate progress. And we really hope that that message is heard at COP as a sign that the US can deliver on its commitments. So.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank the panel for sharing this report. I know that for those that have been watching from the sidelines, we were excited to see this report come out. The timing couldn't be better. And I thank everybody for joining us today. So with that, we'll wrap up this panel. And, before I invite my co-presenter, Amy Holm, to come up, I think just sort of to reiterate what Kevin was saying and what the panelists were saying is that non-state actors and states have a role to play in addition to the federal government, and that the technologies that we have are available to us. They just need an all-in strategy. So with that, I'd like to bring up Amy Holm, our Executive Director of the Climate Registry, for our next presentation.